Okay, now let's talk about loops. So in one of the previous, I think one of the very first tutorial video, I have mentioned that the draw function, it runs in a loop. What running in a loop means is that once it is completed, it starts running again. So this block gets executed over and over. And I did say that it gets run at a frame rate of 60 frames per second. And there's actually an inbuilt P5JS variable that allows us to look at that frame numbers that have been iterating and increasing as the program has been running. And that's called frame count. So if you just go like console.log frame count, you can basically see how many frames have passed ever since the program started running. And as I have said, it is running at the speed of 60 frames per second. Great. So let me get this out of the way. Okay, but how about if we want to create our own loops, our own iterations that go over and over? So for that, we have a few options which allow us to create our loops and run the same function multiple times. The very first way to make a loop is using a while loop. So if you remember, when we used an if statement, we had a condition within the parentheses. And if that condition was true, the block got executed. But with if statement, that block only gets executed once. Like if it's true, you get like a console. Let's do like log. Yay. So with the if statement, I only get one. But if I want to loop this, what I can do is I just write a while function. And what while loop does is that as long as the condition within is true, it runs the block over and over. Okay. I think it crashed. Yep. There you go. It's running over and over. Now stop this. Okay. I don't want this to be here anymore. Okay. Let me refresh. Another loop that we can use is called for loop. So for loop, it's not as straightforward as a while loop. In the way that the while loop it iterates over and over, and while the condition is true, it gets executed. So for the for loop, you use it when you know how many iterations you approximately need. And the syntax for using the for loop, it's a bit confusing, but once you get the hang of it, it feels very intuitive, and usually it starts to make sense. So the way we do for loop is, first of all, you need to declare a variable, and then you need to initialize it. Maybe let's use I. I is the general convention, but your variable could be called anything. Okay, let's just go with I for this, and you initialize it with any value you want. Then you put an upper limit, a condition for I to be within. So for me, I'm going to keep my I less than 10. And then I also need an iteration, which is going to be getting executed within each loop. And for that, I'm just going to increase I by 1. So what happens is that within each block, I starts from going 0 to 10, and it goes up with each turn. So if we run this, we can see that the I goes from 0 to 9. It runs 10 times, starting from 0 and ending at 9. And you don't have to be increasing all the time. You can also do the other way around, where you can be decreasing one by one. And now what's going to happen is I is going to start at 10 and is going to get reduced by 1 as long as it's greater than 0. So now it's going to be 9, and it doesn't get 0 because the condition is that it's greater than 0. So if you want to make it equal, greater than and equal to 0. So yeah, and it runs 11 times now. Remember, you're starting to count from 0 in this case. And yeah, you can like just play around with these values and see what they do for you. And usually most of the cases, having the flexibility to edit out these numbers is going to be very useful. So the question is also, I just talked about loops, but why do we want to use loops? Why are we just not, running these functions over and over? And the answer is basically loops make our lives much more easier. They allow us to condition things, and it saves time by repeating like the same action over and over. Um, so maybe like for a little demonstration, let me declare like a variable x equals 20, and then I'm going to have another fx, and maybe like xx, that was going to be equal to minus 20, and then so while xx is less than or equal to width of the screen, I'm going to make my fill. Let's make good color, like this. Let's draw an ellipse at the position of xx, y with the size of 40. And then I'm going to increase xx plus equal 40. Okay, so let's run this and see if it works. Great. So what's happening over here is this is an example of a while statement that is running with a condition. Okay, so what I have done in here is like a quite useful demonstration of a while loop. And what I did was I declared this variable xx, and it is within the condition that it should be less than or equal to width. And as long as it is less than width, within each while loop iteration, I am setting my field to be this cyan blue and drawing an ellipse at that point of xx and y. And then the xx gets incremented by 40, which is the size of the circle in each iteration. And you may have realized that this is actually like very similar to for loop, right? I am controlling my while loop using a condition with an upper limit, and within each iteration, I'm increasing it. And that is actually very similar to for loop. It's basically the same principle, and I can implement the very same thing by using the for. So I'm going to use this time the x variable in here, and x starts from 20, and the condition is that this x has to be less than or equal to this. And then in each iteration, the x, it goes up by 40. Great. And now for this one, maybe let's make the fill red. so we can see a bit of the difference. And then we will draw an ellipse at this, at the size, a bit of a smaller size. I'm thinking like 20. So let's run this. There you go. And with the for loop, I'm basically doing the same thing. So, the loop you use, it depends on your taste. Whichever you feel more comfortable, whichever makes more sense, feel free to use that one. Since we have covered loops now, I think it's a great time for us to revisit the very first exercise we did, where we draw the star. And I want you to look through the code and see if there's anything that could be simplified by using a loop. And that already shows itself how we are iteratively drawing the triangle and rotating it. And since we know how to make it over a certain iteration, we no longer need to use this long and annoying and repetitive code. I can just cut it from here, and then let me just also cut from here. Let me create a for loop. I starts at 0. I is less than 5, and I goes up in each iteration. And within that, we're going to have this one. Okay, let me tidy it up a bit. Okay, great. Okay, now let's run it. Yep, it does the same thing with just a few less lines. And this is also why the for loops are quite useful.